Hi there. This is Henrik Movie. I am the author of the book Bounce of Vanum. You can find the book down in the description. I'll put it down there if you want to buy it. This video is basically a preview of the book where you get to listen to the uh, prologue, the first 3 chapters of the book, and 1 chapter of the secondary main character. So I hope that's enough for people to kind of get an idea about how the book is. So hopefully people will find it interesting and will want to buy it. Uh, a lot of people have also asked me about an audiobook. I want to make this happen, but I'll probably need to save up some money. I haven't had time to check how much it costs making that, and I want to make it good if I'm going to do something like that. So I want to make it happen. I'll probably make it happen at some point, but it's down the line somewhere. I should also say I am working on the book 2 of this series. It is on the way. I've written about 140 pages or something, I think. So it's on the way. But I'll probably need a year or two to finish it because I'm just one guy doing this next to my regular job. So uh, yeah, I need time, basically. Yeah. Well, I guess we'll just move on to the preview. So hope you all enjoy and find it interesting. And as I said at the start, the book is down in the description if you want to buy it. Thank you.
Prologue. The god watched the world move in slow motion, the many people in every corner of it. Everyone a different person with a different combination of goals, values, morals, skills, and experiences. Little did they know that their lives were just a preparation stage of sorts, a chance for them to develop, to show their worth, and to give the god a chance to determine what person would fit, where, after their death in this world. There were countless other worlds, more important worlds, worlds that needed heroes, villains, or sometimes something in between. Another life was snuffed out, a heroic death, all things considered. A male had thrown himself in front of a truck to push a little child out of the way. The god peeked into the past of the male. He had lived a solid and good life and had a relatively keen mind and a strong want to do good, although he had spent most of his life trying not to bother others. This world was a safe place after all, and there was little need for heroes. He had treated people fairly and made a solid effort to be a good and honest man. Of course, he had his share of mistakes and flaws. All humans do have. But that was not what was important. The god knew where to place the male. Normally, the male would have been digged or reborn. That was not necessary in this case. He was still young and healthy, and the injuries that killed him would be healed before he was brought over. His next life would be a lot harder, but he would not enter it without some divine aid. The god knew he had the capability and moral strength to use this gift in a good way, a way to move the course of his new world in the right direction. Waking up, I woke up. Surprisingly, it was not in a hospital bed. I recalled jumping out in front of that truck, pushing the girl to safety. I remembered getting hit, and a part of me felt as if I had died in that very moment. Waking up felt weird, and what made it even weirder was that I woke up in a hole in the ground, much like that of a meteor crash site. A constant screeching of unknown birds and insects came from all around me. Were I in a jungle? While pushing myself up, I realized to my horror that not only were I surrounded by thick foliage, I was also butt naked. I had been hit by a freaking truck. How had I ended up naked in the jungle? Not only had I been in a city and should have been brought to hospital, but hey, I didn't live in this type of climate. My habitat was far north, and to get to a jungle, you would have to travel an hour by car to the airport and then by plane for about 10 hours. This was crazy. Then I realized something else. I looked down on my body. A memory flashed. Flesh being torn, bits and pieces being out of place or ripped off altogether. My body, on the other hand, didn't have a scratch, which seemed impossible. Maybe I really did die in that crash. Maybe I somehow had been reborn. I took a second glance at the foliage around me. I was clearly in a jungle, but I thought it looked slightly off. I tried to recall memories, trying to remember what the jungles I had seen in various medias looked like. I shook my head. Someone familiar with jungles would have been able to tell, but to me, it was impossible to tell if anything was really off, or if it was just a notion I had. I guessed it didn't matter. I was alone, stark naked in the jungle. I had to survive somehow, and I only hoped that what I could remember from being a scout as a kid would be enough. The crater felt like the safest place around, and so I decided to make that my base for now. I started searching the nearby area, being careful not to walk too far off into the jungle so I wouldn't find my way back. I quickly discovered that some of the leaves had water on them, suggesting it had been raining not too long ago. Hopefully that was a sign of rainy weather on a regular basis here, which would remove my biggest concern of finding drinkable water. However, it also suggested that I probably should make some kind of shelter. It was warm enough now, for sure, but that would probably not be the case during a stormy night. I started to look for and gather potential tools as I walked, picking up sticks of various sizes. Some of them a good size for a potential spear if I found a way to sharpen them. If not, they would serve as a simple stick to whack stuff with. The longer sticks I found were brought back to the crater to be used for building a shelter later on. I was hoping to find a sharp rock that I could use as a makeshift knife, but I had no such luck. I did, however, find a fruit of some kind, hanging from a tree. I didn't know if they were poisonous or not. Hell, I didn't know if fruits hanging from trees could be poisonous. I only knew of tree fruits that was edible, like apples, bananas, pears, and coconuts. Hopefully these fruits would be able to nourish me while not killing me with some exotic toxin. I had half expected having to climb the tree to get the fruits, but knowing I was not the best climber, I decided to try the rock approach first. At my sixth throw, I managed to hit one of the larger fruits with some force. Enough force, apparently, to make it drop down and hit the ground with a soft thump. After another handful of throws, now aiming for the larger fruits, knowing them to be easier to dislodge, I managed to get a few more, bringing them back to the crater before continuing my search through the jungle. After having rounded the nearby forest, I noticed that I started to get tired. My feet, not used to walking about barefoot, were hurting, and I felt hungry. I gave up trying to find a sharp piece of rock and decided to attempt making my own. After all, I had found rocks, just not sharp ones. I grabbed the biggest rock I could find and pulled it out into the open. I tried to make it as steady as possible, pushing dirt and other rubble under it to stop it from wobbling. Then I found a smaller rock, lifted it over my head, and brought it down onto the larger rock with all the force I could muster. With a crack, the smaller rock broke in two, making two smaller stones with a slight edge instead of one round one. I smiled as I repeated the effort with one of the halves, making two even smaller but also sharper rocks. This would do nicely, I thought to myself as I flipped the stone into the air, feeling the weight as it came back down into my palm. Using the stone, I started sharpening one side of a sturdy stick. It's incredible how much more confident you feel alone in the jungle when you have a weapon in your hand. After making my spear, I decided to open one of the fruits using one of my sharp stones. The chosen fruit reminded me a bit of a watermelon, except it grew on a tree and had a yellow coloring. The insides turned out to be more like that of a coconut, and most of the contents spilled out once I got it open. The liquid inside was a bit sour, but drinkable for sure. There was also a thin layer of fruit flesh on the inside, like a coconut, but it was a lot sweeter than the liquid inside. I ate what I could scrape out of the fruit before continuing my work. At least now I knew I had both food and drink for the night. I could also probably gather some rainwater from the leaves. Given I found something to gather it in, I eyed the open fruit, and the idea struck me. The shell of the fruit was perfect for just such a task. Then I decided that the next thing on my agenda would be to do something about my nakedness. I gathered some large leaves, which was the best I could do at the moment. At least it would hide my private parts if I were to run into anyone else out here. I spotted some vines that could act as a rope, to hold my outfit together, first of all, but they would also come in handy when building some shelter later on. The only problem was that the vines were located pretty far up among the trees. I had never boasted about being a good climber, and luckily enough, not all the trees were long and straight. I picked a tree that was slightly slanted and had several branches not too far up. At first it was easy. I was almost able to walk along its trunk. Further up, however, it became more difficult. I slid more than once, which left some bad burns on my feet, and I even broke the nail on one of my toes. I didn't manage to get all the way up, until I decided to drop the rock I had tried to bring with me. Only then, I finally managed to get hold of one of the branches and pull myself up. It became a bit easier once I had reached the branches, as they were thick enough to stand on while not being too far apart for me to walk between them with relative ease. But then I ran into another problem, getting the vine loose. I tried to pull on one of them, but it would not let go of the tree it was part of. Then I tried to twist it, with little success. Finally, I gave up on the vine and decided to test out a few more. Maybe I could find a thinner one that would be easier to get loose. When I got to my fourth vine, I finally made some progress. Twisting and pulling, it finally gave in a bit from my efforts, and a few moments later, it was loose. I would have liked to have more vines, but this was the thinnest one I had spotted so far, and even this one had left my hands aching from the effort of getting it loose. Then I got the bright idea that I could use this vine to get back up the tree with one of my sharp rocks. I bound it to one of the branches on the tree I had climbed at first. Once again, I tried to scale it with a rock, using the vine as support this time. It wasn't easy, but this time I managed to get up, bringing the rock along with me. Harvesting vines turned out to be a lot easier when you could cut them loose with a few well-placed strikes with the sharp side of a rock. Back in my crater, I finally started putting my clothes together. It was nothing fancy, leaves twined into a vine that I tied around my waist. It wasn't comfortable, and it would still reveal everything if I moved about too much. But at least it was something to wear. Then I started on my shelter, a simple construction, binding sticks together to make the skeleton structure where I could lean more sticks onto. After having made a kind of roof using various sticks, I covered the top with large leaves to make it somewhat waterproof. It wasn't much, but at least it would be a dry place to rest. Finally, I started making a fire. It was getting late, and I didn't like the idea of being alone in the jungle without even a source of light. In addition, animals usually kept away from fire, which would give me some additional protection. Hell, someone might even see the smoke and come save me. Using a stone, I tried to grind off tiny splinters of wood to make the fire happen easier. Having a small pile on a piece of wood, I started grinding a stick down into the pile, rubbing it between my hands to create friction. Darkness had arrived, and my hands were hurting when I finally saw some results. A small spark in between the splinters. I threw more splinters onto the small light and blew carefully. A small flame came to life. Adding some bigger pieces, I soon had a stable fire burning. The soft glow lit up the sides of my crater. Finding slime. My first night in the jungle was quite awful. My body was exhausted, and my feet and hands were aching and bruised from the work of the day. The noises from the jungle didn't help much. Awful noises, eager to help my imagination, creating terrible monsters that wanted to eat me. It grew colder as well, but my shelter and fire held that at bay enough so that I didn't freeze at the very least. The good thing was that it didn't rain. But even that comfort was taken from me as I heard the first drops of rain hit the leaves as the sky started to brighten. I was miserable. Rain was pouring from the sky, hitting the ground hard enough for dirt to splash up at my feet. My shelter kept me from getting too wet, and I was glad I had built it up towards one side of the crater, as a dirty brown pool had started to gather inside it. My feet and hands were still hurting, and my muscles were tired. Even my stomach complained, although it was not for lack of food, as I had stuffed my face with more fruits this very morning. I ended up just sitting there, crouched down, my feet the only thing keeping more of me from getting with the dirt-turned mud inside my little shelter. I watched the water running down the side and the rain splashing all around the crater. I just wished that the rain would come to a halt. Now that I had felt the cold of the night, I feared what would happen if I didn't keep dry for the night to come. Watching the water became sort of a game to me. I was looking for patterns as the drops fell, but every time I seemed to find one that was broken by a new possible pattern or a gust of wind blowing the rain off course. Then I found a new pattern to follow, just to see that it was interrupted a moment later. I didn't know for how long I sat there, but the rain seemed endless. Then my attention was drawn to something else, the water running down the sides toward the center of the crater. Just that one stream, or rather the small pool, which seemed to move in the opposite direction of the stream it was part of. I shook my tired head and rubbed my sleepy eyes. Yes, a small pool, the size of my palm, did indeed seem to move in the wrong direction. Was it a trick of the eyes? I perked up, checking the wind, but it was far too weak to make something like this happen. I watched the small pool closely as it crept closer to me, seeming more and more like a small blob of mostly still water, almost entirely covered in the water running over it as it moved up towards me. Was this magic? I looked around, expecting to see some wizard with a pointy hat grinning at me from the trees. But my eyes found nothing out of the ordinary. Looking back at the blob, it was now creeping out of the stream of water that ran from the side of my shelter, keeping on its path towards me. Getting a closer look at it now, it definitely seemed magical, a bit like a round piece of jelly moving on its own. No, jelly was not the right word. It seemed clearer than the water around it, though some dirt was still swirling around inside of it, as if it was merely encased in a thin layer of jelly and its inside was consisting of water. Though that did not entirely explain it either, as the drops of rain stirring its surface made it clear. Even its surface was more watery than any jelly I had ever seen before. How it kept its shape through the rain and running water was beyond my intelligence. As it got closer, I started to get worried. It didn't seem dangerous, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. Using the butt of my spear, I poked it. The poke made it stop, and it wobbled slightly, as if struggling to keep itself grounded. As it stopped wobbling, it also started moving again. It really didn't seem dangerous, and my spear seemed perfectly fine where it had touched the blob of water. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to poke it with my finger this time. Crouching down, I poked my finger at it. It wobbled as it had done with my spear, but as I pushed my finger further against it, I suddenly found my finger inside of it. It was cold and wet, and the parts of my finger that was inside felt kind of tingly. It felt as if it was trying to hold on to me, but it was weak, just slightly stronger than the surface of regular water, in fact, and I was able to pull my finger out easily, making it wobble once again. As soon as the wobbling stopped, it started to move towards me once again. Curious as I was, I tore loose some of the flesh of a fruit lying in my shelter. I dropped the small piece into the blob, and it entered the blob of water with ease, which made the thing stop. I studied the phenomenon closely, waiting to see what would happen. At first it seemed as if nothing was happening, but as time went by, I realized that something indeed was happening, right in front of me. The piece of fruit was slowly starting to fall apart, ever so slightly, bit by bit. A slow process taking hours, even with such a small piece of fruit. Something that would only be a danger to small bugs caught inside of it, or a piece of fruit. This thing was far too small and weak to ever pose a danger to me. And then it dawned on me. I thought I knew what this thing was. This was, as far as I could tell, a real-life slime. I quickly looked up, expecting to see more moving around in the rain now that I knew what to look for. But I didn't notice any more, and after a while I gave up and returned my attention to the slime inside my shelter. I watched it closely as it just sat there, slowly eroding the piece of fruit. Occasionally I dropped another bit in, once the previous bit was starting to disappear. I felt an odd sense of kinship to this creature. Sure, it was just a dim blob that likely had less mental capacity than a regular fly. But it was all alone, just like me, and it was the first company I had experienced since waking up in this crater. "Hey, maybe you could be my companion? A little friend helping me out on my great adventures?" I said out loud. I didn't expect an answer, and I didn't get any. Not even a slight jiggle as a response. "Well, I guess you wouldn't be very useful, but you could follow me around like a little puppy. Maybe I could learn you little tricks." I somewhat enjoyed talking out loud again, even if I didn't get any response. "I could feed you little things along the way, and you could sit on my shoulder and watch my back. Who knows, maybe I could teach you to jiggle when danger is nearby." I dropped another piece of fruit to the slime. Then, all of a sudden, an odd feeling came over me. It was as if I could feel the slime, not as in touching it, but more along the lines of a bond being formed, and me knowing what it was on a deeper level. I wrinkled my brow and took a closer look at it. It hadn't changed at all. It didn't move, jiggle, blob, or anything like that. Maybe it was just my imagination. I leaned my head back, feeling my neck having grown tired from looking down so much. Closing my eyes as I rubbed the back of my neck, I suddenly realized something. There was something, a feeling that had not been there before. I kind of felt the slime. Using my mind's eye, I saw the little jelly creature about to finish up its meal. Opening my eyes, I saw that it was indeed true. I quickly dropped another piece of fruit down into the slime and closed my eyes again. Yes, now there was a bigger piece the slime was eating at. Was I going crazy? Digging deeper into this feeling, I was able to sense more things about the slime. It felt weak and dumb to my mind, and I could kind of feel that it was the case even among its own kind. An idea popped into my head, and I tried to put what I felt into little stat blocks I visualized in my head. And right enough, I somehow got a reading on the creature dropping into the stat blocks in a smoother manner than if I had just imagined it on my own. It also stayed like that when I stopped focusing on it. Opening my eyes, shaking my head before closing my eyes once again, they had still not changed. What was this? I tried changing around the system I had imagined, coming up with new stats to measure, deleting old ones and warping the scaling. But the general stats didn't change. It was as if I was always seeing the correct level of whatever I wanted to measure, in terms of the slime, in my head. It reminded me a bit of Pokemon, as if I had caught a small critter and now could see its stats and moves. Yet it was some time since I had been into Pokemon, and so it was hard to imagine the stats related to that game and to put said stat into context. I needed something that I was more familiar with in more recent times. I eventually landed on the D and D-like system for stats. It was a decent system, and I found it easy to see something's relative strength in that system. The stats of the slime bottomed down to a single point in every stat block: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. I actually felt as if the slime was lower than 1 in most categories. It was just how low the system would go. It felt kind of satisfying having put it all into system, but still it felt a bit weird, as if I didn't quite believe it. I decided to do one final test. I decided to try to increase one of the stats, determining that if it worked, this was all in my head. I settled for a random stat, constitution, and tried to push it up to a 2. I felt a bit disappointed when it worked, and for just half a second, I thought this was all some kind of weird jungle fever. But then exhaustion hit me. Not a physical one, but a mental one. As if pushing the stat up a point had taken a huge amount of mental effort. Opening my eyes, I saw the slime still eating away at the piece of fruit from earlier. Then my eyes went wide as I realized the slime seemed bigger. I brought my hand forward, wanting to confirm what my eyes were telling me. And right enough, the slime was indeed slightly bigger. That confirmed it in my head. I had somehow made the slime healthier, which also meant slightly bigger. Now the only question was why it had tired me out. I closed my eyes again, trying to feel whatever it was inside my mind. And there it was, an energy of some kind, weak and used up, but slowly refilling itself. I imagined it being a bar, and so it came into existence for my inner eye. A bar, almost depleted with a golden glowing color, filling it ever so slowly. This was how I had done it. And I could do it again. Given I let it refill enough first, maybe the slime could be of use, eventually. I sat down, feeding the slime another piece of fruit. What would be the best way to use this? As of now, I could only guess at what various changes would do to it. Strength would probably make it able to hold on to things better. Dexterity would probably make it less clumsy, and maybe even make it a bit faster. Constitution obviously increased its size. Intelligence, usually referred to as book smart in D&D, would likely make it better at learning and remembering stuff. Wisdom, usually referred to as street smart, would likely make it better at noticing and figuring things out on its own. Charisma was generally referred to as people skills. How that would translate for a slime? Well, who knows? Making it bigger and stronger was an obvious way of making it more useful, but one thing stopped me from pursuing this road right away. What use would a larger and stronger slime be if it didn't understand anything that was going on, going purely off whatever base instincts it had? It might end up gobbling on me, its understanding not going past eat stuff and move to more stuff to eat. It was decided. Even if it meant the slime would be useless for a longer time, I had to make it smarter first. If possible, I had to make it smart enough to at least be able to come to an understanding with it. That again led me to another question. I had already used a lot of the goldish magical point on getting its constitution up to 2. Had I planned this out ahead of me doing that, I would have put it into wisdom or intelligence. The question was it possible to remove stat points? And would I then regain my spent golden points? It was only one way to find out. I closed my eyes, focusing in on the slime once again. Seeing its stat, I then concentrated on removing the extra point into Constitution. And it worked! The stat ticked down to a single point once again. And what more? Some of the golden juice returned. Less than I had hoped, but still a sizable amount. It seemed as if some of the golden points were used up in the process of doing stuff to the creature. Still, by my judgment, it was enough to get wisdom up 1 point, letting it get to a total of 2 points. I did the deed, and almost immediately I felt my head start to pound as the golden bar almost bottomed out, only a thin line remaining. I felt sick and wanted to throw up. Using too much of the stuff was bad, apparently, and I swore then and there to never let it bottom out again. My new discovery had raised my mood, and it rose even higher when the rain stopped right before sundown. That improvement, however, quickly fell again when I realized I would be unable to start a fire this night. I had no dry wood, and the likelihood to find any out in the jungle this soon after the rain was in my estimation a big fat 0. And so, my second night in the jungle turned out to be even more miserable than the first one. Yes, I had a little companion with me now, but I could hardly even see the slime in the dim moonlight. The noises coming from the jungle were no more pleasant than the first night. In fact, they sounded even closer. I clutched my spear throughout the night, unable to get any sleep whatsoever. I was glad when the sun finally started to brighten the sky. I was tired, my body aching for sleep, but I knew it was not the time. I needed to prepare, deciding on my first priority, to make a shelter for dry wood, which meant I would need some small degree of flooring to stop the wet ground from seeping into the wood. Before starting today's work, however, I had some other business that needed to be taken care of. My bowels had been complaining all night, but I wanted to keep my campsite from getting even more muddy, so I decided it was wise to wait. Now, however, as I crouched down in the woods, I learned what a diet of exotic fruity fruits did to a man. My ass opened wide, and a thin brown sludge shot out as if from a fire hose. Once done, it felt like someone had used my bunghole to test a new grain of sandpaper, and it was painful even to walk back to the camp. I decided to put that of finding some real food on my list of things to do. It was about midday when I finally finished up the storage shelter meant for firewood. I had put out a trail of little pieces of fruit around the camp for Slime to follow. Yes, I had given the slime a name now. I found Slime moving towards the second last piece of fruit I had put out when I had finally put the last leaf onto the roof. I upgraded Slime before starting to put out a new trail for Slime to follow. I realized I would have to get more fruit, as well as sticks to put in the new firewood shelter. Luckily, gathering fruits turned out to be way more easy now that I had a relatively easy way up into the trees, using the vine I had bound to the branches above the slanted tree. Starting to gather firewood, I decided on what my project for the rest of the day would be. I still had a lot of vines left from building the firewood shelter. If I found some more sturdy sticks, I could probably make some kind of a spiked fence, securing my sleeping area to at least some degree. I was both tired and sleepy, yet the thought of having a somewhat secure place to sleep drove me on with my new project. By sunset, I had indeed built a few spiked barricades of sort, though they weren't as sturdy as I had hoped. At the very least, they would trip up anything trying to get to me, giving me a chance to wake up and grab my spear. Slime had stopped moving and was just sitting there, totally still. Maybe it had tired itself out from moving all day. Anyway, I upgraded Slime another point before starting the tedious task of making a fire. The river. For the first time since arriving in this jungle, I had a good night's sleep. I didn't know whether it was because I was feeling safer in my camp now, with both a fire burning hot and a line of spiked sticks between me and the line of trees, or if it was simply because of how exhausted I was. It didn't matter. When the sun rose, I was still tired, but I felt a lot better. That was until my stomach decided to do a jump. I swore loudly as I struggled to get past my new barricade, running with all might into the woods before having another torrent of anus-destroying liquid shoot out from my behind. That settled it. Today, I was going deeper into the woods to find something to eat other than fruits. Before heading out, I upgraded Slime again and put in some time to make a more elaborate line of fruits for the little critter to follow. I didn't trust the slime to be smart enough to stay in camp if left alone, or to not fall off me and disappear into the jungle if brought along. Luckily, I didn't regard it smart enough to do anything other than follow its basic instinct of eating and then moving on to the next meal. Despite having been brought up to 3 points in both wisdom and intelligence, it didn't show any difference in behavior since I first met it. And even if I were wrong and it was smart enough to do something else now, why would it? I headed out into the jungle. I was terrified of getting lost. Not being able to get back to camp before dark was definitely not something I wanted to experience. To avoid this possibility, I decided to take my time and mark the trees as I went, using my stone to make an arrow pointing towards my camp, or at least towards the last tree I marked, given I had the feeling I had failed to keep on a straight path, despite trying to do so. I also knew that knowing what was north, east, west, and south was not easy when in the thick of the jungle, as I was not able to see the sun most of the time. I had, however, made sure to know in which direction I was walking before leaving camp. I knew I was moving west, so if I got lost, I knew to move east to get back to camp. I only hoped if I ended up in such a situation that I would not end up moving straight past it by accident. After what I judged to be 1, maybe 2 hours, I found my first chance to get something other than fruit for food. A bird had landed on a clearing up ahead and didn't seem to have noticed me. I didn't recognize the bird, but it reminded me a bit of a parrot. I snuck closer and readied my spear, sure not to step on any twigs, as I carefully closed the distance to where I was reasonably sure I could hit it with the spear. Gripping my spear tightly, I leaned back and threw it towards my prey. The bird reacted immediately as my arm snapped forward in the throwing motion. My spear flew forward, spinning slightly as it was not completely straight, and missed completely. I heard the flapping of wings as I walked into the clearing, picking up my spear. Apparently I was neither a good hunter, nor was my weapon a very accurate one. I looked around, hoping to see something else I could chuck my spear at, but nothing presented itself. I moved on, a bit discouraged now, knowing that hunting would be a lot harder than I had first imagined. I walked for about another hour when I heard something. A low, constant whoosh was barely audible up ahead. I knew what it was almost immediately, and so I rushed the rest of the way, sighting the river running through the jungle. I glanced up and down its length, but as I saw no animal or other danger, I hurried over to the river. The current was quite strong, yet I quickly threw off my makeshift clothing and jumped in. I was almost dragged down the river. I rushed to much, but then I caught my footing and was able to haul myself back. The water felt cool against my skin, its clean water washing away the sweat and dirt built up from a long walk through the jungle. I dipped my head under, letting the water drench my face and hair, and came up feeling refreshed and somewhat more hopeful for the day. That hope grew stronger as I saw a fish jumping further up the river. Fetching my spear, I found a good spot to stand in the river. Then I waited. It didn't take long before a fish came close enough for me to spot it through the rapidly moving water. I thrust my spear towards it, missing it barely. The fish quickly swam back out of sight. It was okay. I still had time before I had to make my way back towards the camp. The water was refreshing rather than cold, and I found I didn't mind staying in it for some time. A while later, I spotted another fish approaching. It seemed fatter than the first one, though the waves made it hard to say for certain. This time, I didn't rush. I waited until I had a real good shot. My spear hit something on its way down to the riverbed. Lifting my spear back up, I felt the weight of something, and I cheered as I saw the fish sitting a bit past the tip, my spear having run through its body. I slammed the head of the fish against a stone to make sure it was properly dead, before throwing it onto dry land near my things. Then I went back to watching the water, my spear ready. I managed to get one more fish that day before I found it was time to start moving back to my camp. I had a chance for 2 more, but they had escaped my trap. One I blamed on being too small and hard to hit. The other, however, seemed fat and was a miss, mostly because I was too eager to get my hands on it. Nevertheless, I had 2 fish hanging from a stick I had fashioned for carrying them. I had also taken some time to tear their bellies open using my sharp rock, removing their guts and other unwanted intestine stuff. These fish would fill my belly tonight, a welcome change to the fruit and water diet. I made my way back through the jungle, following my trail of marks on the trees. It took longer than expected, and by the time I was back at camp, it had started to grow dark. Had I waited any longer, I might have been unable to follow the marks on the last stretch, a grim reminder that I should not get too cocky. I was happy to see Slime still in the camp when I got back. It had apparently eaten up all the fruit pieces and was just sitting there, not moving at all. Maybe it was a survival mechanism. I was just about to upgrade slime when I noticed something. Its constitution had risen by 1 point. It seemed a bit bigger than before as well. Maybe eating lots of food and sitting around was how slimes grew. If that was the case, it made sense. This also presented me with an opportunity. By using the energy I had been saving up during the day, while also selling the constitution points slime had gained, I would be able to raise its mental stats to a total of 3 points before going to bed. I upgraded some now, waiting to use all my energy until I went to bed. I wanted to be sure it didn't go down too low. It had been quite bad last time, and who knew what would happen if it reached rock bottom. I started by getting the fire going. It took a lot of time and effort, as always, but I felt like I had started getting the hang of it, and the dry wood stored in my shelter helped a lot. Using the sticks I had sharpened, I put the fish over the open fire, letting them heat up and cook. I found that the noises from the jungle at night didn't bother me much anymore. I had a fence, a weapon, and an open fire. And most importantly, I would soon have fish to fill my belly with food and my arms with strength. Tasting a bite of the first fish, I moaned in the pleasure it brought to my mouth. Back home it would have been a crap meal by all accounts, but this, right now, was better than any of the meals I had ever had back home. I greedily ate the entire fish, even the skin. Only its bones remained, which I sucked dry of as much of its flesh I were able to. Then I dropped it down to Slime, who seemed more than happy to get it dropped on top of it. The entire fish didn't fit into Slime, and I wondered if Slime would be able to absorb the skeleton, but at least it seemed to try to get as much of it into itself as possible. After eating the second fish, I was, for the first time since arriving in the jungle, starting to feel full. I dropped the second skeleton to Slime as well, before going to bed. I took a moment to do one last upgrade to Slime before going to sleep. I woke from a spine-shivering howl, tearing through the regular noises of the jungle. I sat up, clutching my spear, my eyes scanning the edges of the clearing where the howl had come from. The fire had almost entirely died out, and having slept, my eyes were used to the dark. Despite this, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I got up, taking a broader look around the clearing, scanning the line. Nothing. Then another howl tore through the jungle, louder and more horrifying than the last. The sound of a monster roaring its victory, challenging the jungle to oppose it. It sounded far away, however, which brought me some comfort. Whatever it was, I didn't want to meet it. I sat back down, my heart beating hard, and my hands shivering. There was something out there more dangerous than slimes, birds, and fish. Something terrible. I was unable to sleep any more that night. I sat there in my own thoughts, my mind creating horrible monsters in the shadows looking out on me. My fence seemed ridiculous now, my spear inadequate. I couldn't stay in the jungle. I needed to find safety, I needed to find help. I sat there planning my next move, hoping whatever was out there was not coming my way in the darkness of night. When the sun started to brighten the sky, I had a plan figured out. I would move base to the river. It was further away from the direction the howl had come from, and I had easier access to both food and water there. Then I would build a raft and use the river to search a larger area faster than I would otherwise have been able to. Surely I would run into someone along the river at some point. Civilizations were often built up around rivers, making it a lot more likely to find people than me stumbling around in the jungle. Standing up, I noticed how the fish bones from earlier were mostly gone now, only a small bit still floating around inside Slime. Apparently, Slime was able to digest them, though it seemed to take a bit longer. I took a moment to upgrade Slime before moving on with my day. I had decided to bring along as much as possible from my current camp to my new one by the river. That meant taking more than one trip, carrying the stuff I had made, but I saw it as more time efficient than that of making new stuff. I gathered my spiked fences together and bound them loosely with a spare vine I had lying around. Having tied them together like this meant that I could bring them all along in one go. They were a bit heavier than I liked, but it was doable. Before leaving on my first moving trip, I smashed open a fruit and dropped them around for slime. "Take care of the camp while I'm gone," I said before leaving. I knew it didn't understand me. Intelligence and wisdom was still only at 5. Yet it had to acquire an understanding of language in some way, so I might as well start talking to it on a more regular basis so it got used to it. I carried my spiked fences through the jungle, taking a few breaks along the way to catch my breath and to swap what shoulder I was using to carry them to prevent chafing. When I reached the river, I was all sweaty and my muscles were sore. I realized this might be too much, bringing all the stuff in one day. Yet I wanted to bring my shelter and slime along today, so I at least had the makings of a proper camp here by the river. I decided I could fetch the rest tomorrow. Before going back for the second load, however, I decided to take a dip in the river. The water felt good as it washed the sweat off my body and cooled my muscles. Looking down on myself, I noticed I had lost quite a bit of weight. Sure, I had not been directly fat before, but now I was starting to see some definition. At first, I was happy about the development. Then I realized it meant I had less to go on out here in the wilds. After all, fat was the body's natural energy storage. There was a saying about this. I didn't quite remember the exact words, but it went along the lines of listening to a fat survivalist expert as he knew how to get enough food to be comfortable out in the wilds. Once feeling sufficiently refreshed by the river water, I went back to my old camp. I packed down my shelter as best I could, using a vine to keep the various parts together. A lot of the leaves, making it waterproof, fell off, but it was little to do about that. Getting more leaves would be easy enough back at the river camp. What had taken the most work was preparing and binding the various sticks together after all. I had planned to bring slime along on this trip. It was the first time I had picked it up, but it went surprisingly easy. It just wobbled a bit in my hand. I tried placing it on my shoulder, hoping it would stay there so I had a free hand to carry my spear and some vines as well. That too went surprisingly well. It was as if the slime tried to glue itself to my shoulder. I didn't feel the tingling feeling I had felt the first time I was in contact with it. That was good news. It meant it didn't try to eat my shoulder. Whether that was because it was still gobbling on a piece of fruit, or if it was because the two of us had some kind of kinship now, I didn't know. But it didn't really matter for this trip anyways. Once back at the river camp, I used the rest of the day to set up camp, gather new leaves for the roof, firewood and fruits. It was already getting dark when the thought of fishing struck me. It was too late for that now. I would have to do with fruits for this evening's feast. The fish had helped a little bit on my stomach situation, and the idea of going back to the ass-destroying tornado was not a pleasant one, but I had little choice in the matter now. I ate some fruit and then, after upgrading slime, I went to bed.
Before the storm, large flakes of snow were falling, landing in Sarah's golden hair. She had taken off her helmet, which was against the rules, but she wanted to take in the feeling and smell of fresh snow. Along with that smell came that of the soldiers clogging the streets, of the many fires working to hold people warm as they waited. It would not be much longer now. A man in armour, white with golden and black lines, much like hers but larger and bulkier, stepped up the stairs towards her. As he arrived at her location, he reached up and unfastened his own helmet, breaking the rules just as she had, lifting it off a worn but strong face surrounded by mostly greyed hair. Varus, the man known as the Great Defender, was tall, taller than most, as he was himself from these lands so far to the north. Sarah felt small standing so close to this legend among men. "How are you feeling?" he asked, a veteran speaking to a younger soldier who had never seen a battle before. His tone annoyed her, but she kept her tone civil. It would not do if two of the saints were seen fighting before a battle such as this. "I'm fine," "The prophet has promised us victory," she said. "This is to be the battle that turns the tide." Varus nodded to her words, but he didn't seem to like them. The prophet has always been right before, yet he did not foresee the cost of this victory. "What are you saying?" Sarah said, unable to mask the annoyance in her voice this time. "Nothing," he laughed. He laughed. Sarah bit her jaws together. "I guess it's just the old soldier in me that fears the losses that always follow war. The light knows we have had enough losses in this one already." "There is nothing to fear," she replied. "Those who die do so for the sake of humanity. It is our task to bring those who threaten humanity to justice." Sarah hated this kind of pointless philosophizing. To her annoyance, Varus looked at her with concern. He seemed as if he was about to say more, so Sarah decided to cut him off and point their talk into something more practical. "You have faced the enemy. What are they like?" she asked. The worry in his face seemed to fade at her question, which was good. "They are like nothing I have ever faced. None of them seems to worry about their own death. Some even seem eager to meet it. They seem to revel in the bloodshed as if there is nothing else to this world." He didn't speak of the various enemy types, which was good. She had had more than enough time to read the reports of the berserkers diving into their lines, eager to take as many lives as possible before going down themselves, the giant armoured creatures with hands like boulders acting almost like siege equipment, flyers throwing fire from the sky. She could see why the province army had lost almost every battle they had committed to. "Did you ever see our target?" Tara asked, as Varus seemed to pause his speech. "No, I did not. I tried finding it at the battlefield at first, hoping that if I could kill it, the slaughters would stop. Then I learned that the general of the Vanka army had intentionally kept me away from any battle the Terror had been likely to show up on." Varus seemed almost angry as he said the last part, an expression Sarah had never seen on the man. "It was as it had to be," Sarah said, feeling a bit of regret for her earlier annoyance with the man. He was always looking to save as many people as possible. He was a foolish man, but he was admired for a reason. "I know, it was according to the plan of the prophet. But still, if I had faced it, maybe their advance could have been halted one more day. How many thousands of lives could that have saved?" "It might have cost us more in the long run," Sarah found herself saying. "All those earlier battles have been leading to this one. There is nothing left to strike but White Crossing up here now. The city has the tallest and strongest walls in all the north. St. Lucas has had time to bolster them further as you slowed their advance. The city garrison has been bolstered by what remains of the Vanka army, adventurers, and even Border Kingdom forces. The second army is also here, ready to spring the trap, and a total of 4 saints have been gathered. I know. Stopping their advance here is the most important thing so they don't spill into the western and southern provinces, but it still annoys me. It's like the prophet has designed this entire war to— No, that is not fair." Varus broke himself off. "It just pains me the cost it took to get to this point. According to the prophet, we will both be needed," Sarah said, nodding. "The war turns when the demonic terror is killed." Suddenly, Varus broke out laughing. "You know what? I came here as your senior to comfort you before the battle, and yet I am the one that ends up having my spirits raised." He laughed, patting her on the shoulder just as a messenger came running up. The messenger was a young boy, lightly armoured and with a swift, unarmoured horse. He seemed to shiver before them. His build and complexion suggested he was from further south. So it might have been the cold, but he was also clearly hesitant to interrupt anything, despite the message seeming urgent. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "I was sent by the generals to inform you that—" He was interrupted as a screech howled over the battlement, the messenger almost falling in surprise. There was no need for the messenger to finish what he was saying. The enemy was here.